And good afternoon to everybody on this rather pleasant, if somewhat warmish and muggy day here in Pittsburgh. Hope you're all keeping well. I hope you're all out there. Say hi to me if you're there. And if you're not there, if you're tuning in later today or later in the week or another day, you can't say hi to me because it's already pre-recorded. But in the meantime, if you are there, I'm always delighted to see you. And we're going to have a very interesting webinar today. I'm really looking forward to this one. It's very special because I'll tell you in a moment, but it is concerned with our future planning at PICT, aside from its importance in itself. So I do hope you enjoy it as much as I think I'm going to enjoy it. What news do I have for you, apart from the weather? As usual, I want to say thank you to the Allegheny Foundation for their wonderful sponsorship of this particular series of webinars, taking us through to the end of this year. I want to remind you, of course, as always, that every donation helps and that we are in the middle of our summer fundraising campaign, which is going to help us produce our 25th anniversary season, which will be starting, we'll be back on stage, thank goodness, in November with Shakespeare's Wonderful As You Like It. And all your donations, no matter how small or large, they go towards production. We don't use your donations to do anything else other than put on the plays. So any donation you can send us, no matter how small, it all counts, it all matters, and we are grateful for every single dollar that comes into us. If you do spread the word about our webinars and the fact that they're on our YouTube channel, do try to encourage your friends and relatives and even people you don't like. Do encourage them to sign up to subscribe to the YouTube channel, because the more subscribers we get, the more benefits we get from being on YouTube, including closed captioning. So as I've said before, you can actually just read what I'm saying rather than listen to me droning on. So please spread the word. It would be of enormous value if you did that. Come next Friday. Next Friday. Yes, next Friday. Yep. Friday of next week from today, we will be making our formal season announcement on YouTube and on Facebook at 7:30 in the evening, which is Pittsburgh time, Eastern Standard if you're in America, and if you're in the UK or Ireland, you'll be 5 hours later with you. But anyway, the announcement is going to be made on Friday of next week, what our city is. Also, you still have an opportunity to vote. If you go to the Pittsburgh City Paper website, you can vote in the Best of Pittsburgh. And we've been nominated in 3 categories for theatre. We've been nominated for Best Theatre Company, Best Virtual Production, which was our radio version of Christmas Carol, and also for Best Virtual lecture program, or whatever it's called. And that is for this webinar series. So please go on to the Pittsburgh City Theatre or City Paper website, look out for the Best in Pittsburgh. And I will point out that our dear colleagues at City Theatre are also nominated, but try to emphasize your preferences. Hello, Grace in Dublin. Try to, and hello, Barbara. Thank you. I'm looking forward to this one too. Do consider putting a vote in for PICT Classic Theatre in any of those or all of those 3 categories. We would much appreciate it. Hello, James and Debbie. Everybody's pouring in now. David, there you are. David, one of our UK regulars. Marlene, another regular, but from Squirrel Hill, somewhat closer to home. Martin Giles, love the voice in the background. Yes, indeed. As many of you know, my general operations manager and webinar producer, Catherine, sits in the other room while doing this to make sure I don't screw it up. Hello, Dennis, from muggy Greensburg. Yeah, it's a bit muggy here, but it's still not unpleasant. Hello, Prime Stage. Our colleagues at Prime Stage, welcome. I haven't seen you saying hello before, but I'm delighted to see you saying it now. Anybody else out there wants to have a quick hello before we continue? Anyway, those are the two major announcements. Season announcement coming a week from today, and please vote on City Paper, Best of Pittsburgh, for us, please. It does help. Just like your small, medium, or large donations. Whatever you want to give us, please consider it. So, it's nearly time. The latecomers have probably parked their cars. They're probably here. We will make a beginning. Now, today there's more people than we would normally have. And in particular, I'm joined by my associate producer, Sharon Mckeon. And we have two other guests this week. So it's a big co-hosting session. We have Randy Reinholz and we have Jean Bruce Scott. And our topic of the week, as you probably saw on the banner that came up, is concerned with native writing, and particularly native playwriting in America. So we call this webinar Our Vital Stories, Conversation on Native Playwrights. Both of our guests are considered, can absolutely be considered experts in this field. They're both writers, producers, and teachers. They have worked on, developed, produced, presented over 200 new works by Native American playwrights. They are co-founders of Native Voices at the Autry. They are a pair of remarkable people. And so I want to welcome, as well as Sharon Mckeon, who is an infinitely greater authority on this topic than I am. As I said before, I have no expertise in this field, but an absolute fascination for it and a growing interest and determination to help present these works that are on what might well describe as the classic topic of Native American life, Native American tradition, customs, and through that, Native American drama. So I want to welcome Sharon Mckeon, and I also want to welcome Randy and Jean to the table. Welcome. Hi there.
Hi
so
there.
I am going to a large extent, pass the buck to Sharon, because Sharon, apart from being a remarkable theatrical performer, also has the grace of being part Native American. So Sharon, you want to talk about that for a moment and introduce our wonderful guests. I'm handing it over to you.
Uh-oh. If I may, and Randy and Jean, if you have one as well, we would love to hear it. If you would allow me, please. This afternoon, I would ask for a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands of those who came before and celebrate those who are here today in what is known in the present day as the Greater Pittsburgh region, the Erie, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, made up of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, Tuscarora, and Cayuga, Kaskaskia, Lenape, Massawomack, Mississauga, Osage, Shawanwaki, Shawnee, Susquehannock, Wyandot, Yuchi, and the pre-European contact cultures of the Adena, Hopewell, and Monongahela. Thank you.
Nicely
Do you have
done.
one, Randy
Thank you,
or Jen?
Sharon.
Thank you.
We're on the traditional lands of the Kumeyaay people. Often, we focus on the attempted annihilation of indigenous peoples from these lands. And while that did occur, and to some extent still is ongoing, we like to celebrate the resiliency of the folks in this region and the important leadership roles the Kumeyaay people have taken on. And we celebrate them and their neighbors here, the Luisweño, and other folks very close. And of course, Kumeyaay people on both sides of the border, what we call Mexico and what we call the United States, right here in this region of San Diego.
Thanks. Okay, so if you wouldn't mind, Randy, you are a member of which nation?
I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So I've been, we actually just had a trip there last month. It was a lot of fun. And trivia fact, What did the Choctaw and the Irish have in common? Well, we're kindred spirits. It says right here on the webpage that is about the Choctaw Native American Monument in County Cork. The Choctaw sent money to the Irish during the famine, and we both know something about attempted colonization and overthrow of culture and resiliency to keep strong in tough times, which I
Can I
think
say
we all
that
can relate to.
That monument is highly regarded, and the Choctaw Nation sent more money. Wasn't a vast amount, but in terms of what they had, they actually sent more money than Queen Victoria did.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
And we
wild.
had just come past the Trail of Tears, so we were just removed from our traditional lands, where almost a fourth of our nation died on that march. So it was not long after that, about a decade after that march, that the money was sent.
It was an incredible gift.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to back up for those of you who don't know you like I do, and I met you a while ago. We won't say how many years, but that's beside the point. How did the two of you meet?
Oh my gosh. You're going back to
Jeannie.
our
Yes, I'm going
origin
back to
story.
your origin story. How did the two of you
Well,
meet?
Oh my gosh, this is a bit embarrassing. Ellen might get a kick out of this. I was doing a show. I had done a show called The Newhart Show. I was an actor for a while here in Los Angeles in Southern California. And I was following a director around by the name of David Steinberg and working on a certificate at UCLA in filmmaking as a director. And so I had come back to The Newhart Show, and a good friend of ours, Bill Sanderson, William Sanderson, who's a wonderful actor in many, many things, he had a fella that was painting his house who was an actor that he brought to the show one night. And after the show, we would go over to a little place. It's not there anymore, but a place called George Santo Pietro's. It was an Italian restaurant just across the street from CBS Radford. And we'd hang out and chat, and it was a nice Friday night. And in walks this adorable fella. And it's like, well, who is that? And so I said hello to everybody, all my pals. And I unfortunately, back in the day, I was a very affectionate hugger. And so I was hugging and kissing everybody. And Randy said, well, don't I get a hug or a kiss or whatever? And so when I went to give him a little kiss, he gave me a little bit bigger of a kiss. And then he kind of looked at me like, well, now what are you going to do about that? So I just stayed with him the whole night and just talked to him, and he was delightful. And that was September 30th, 1988. And we started talking, and we got married a year to the day later. And so that's how long we've known each other and been in conversation. We found out we had so much in common, this whole Irish Choctaw story. And we actually went and visited Choctaw country very early on to meet his grandparents. And so that's how we met. Sharon, it's a typical.
I just got
crazy.
goosebumps.
Oh,
It's so cute. Okay.
Two crazy kids.
Two crazy kids. So I'm trying to follow your timeline. This is work with me here. So, if you, strangest interview kind of that you'll ever have, right? Do you remember, speaking specifically to the Irish Choctaw or not, what was the first memory of a story you were told?
Oh, I think Randy
For
can
both
get
of
this. As I said, we went to the Choctaw Nation very early in our relationship, and Grandpa took us all around, and he took us to meet the chief, and we heard a story there that has stuck with us forever about the integrity and honesty and trustworthiness of Native people and their own legal system. Randy, do you remember the story about the tree?
It's a long story, and this is not perhaps the best forum for it. But essentially, like many oppressed people, indigenous people policed themselves. And so if someone were to commit a crime, the light horse police dished out the punishment. And this was after removal in the mid 1800s to the end of the century. And there was a lot of death sentences carried out. And so there was a very difficult death, and it was people would be released on their own volition, and they would take care of their business, and then they would return to be executed. And it was a very difficult situation. You often picked your best friend, I'm not really understanding why, to carry out the execution, because you wanted it done properly and quickly. And this particular story is the best friend broke down and botched the execution. So it was a very difficult story. There are many iterations of it, and many of the Oklahoma tribes have stories like this. So that was a story that stuck with us. And for whatever reason, the chief really, Hollis, he really wanted us to understand the story. Jeannie and I were both on television at that time. And so they were happy to have people from television in Oklahoma. That was a rarity. So anyway, that's the first really difficult Native story. And then as we founded Native Voices at Illinois State in 1994, we realized there were a lot of difficult stories from American Indian communities. And as we started reading scripts and started thinking about what we might present, the atrocities that were central to the stories were tough. And one guy, Drew Hayden Taylor, put it in context for us. Drew is a wonderful playwright out of Canada and a Ojibwe guy. Said, people who are just getting their voice back often talk about abuse. And so abuse was central to the early part of our work with Native Voices, and presenting those stories, and then figuring out how to have discussions across boundaries. Anyway, I'll stop there. Go ahead, Sharon.
No. That was actually, because that leads me into the, see, you're following my timeline. What was that a seed, or what was the seed that started Native Voices?
So,
go, Jean.
The stories that we heard early on when we traveled through Oklahoma from both Randy's grandparents, and then when we went to meet the chief and the people that we met around that, I think the reason that Chief Hollis wanted to tell us that story was that what we got from that story was resilience. That in fact, the Choctaw, as they moved across country, were on a forced march. They already had their own systems of government. They were very honorable people. This system of if somebody did something that they felt should be punishable by death, they went away and they came back. We asked Hollis, did anybody ever not come back? And he said, no, they always came back. So what we started to see and hear and think about was all of the historical trauma, and the scripts that we were getting really dealt with historical trauma, and then the trauma of the time, which was like the 70s to the 90s, 1970s to the 1990s, was trauma that was current, alcoholism, absentee parents, grandparents raising grandchildren, all of these different things were very present at that time. And so we thought back to what Chief Hollis had talked about, and this idea of resiliency. And so as we started to work on these scripts, Sharon, and we were presenting them, one of the things that we realized was that we were also, besides telling the stories, that we were somewhat perpetuating the trauma. And so we talked about it and talked with other theater makers, and we thought, well, if we could tell contemporary stories, so this now goes into the 90s through 2021, if we could see who Native people were today and how they got there. And so the mandate and the mission for us as theater makers was always to get Native stories on the American stage, that they had been introduced but not always followed up with other stories, and so that was what we wanted to do, and so that's what we spent 25 years working on.
And just to be clear, when Jeannie said we were telling stories, we initially built an arena where Native people could represent themselves and how they wanted to tell the stories they thought were important. And that's been the central guiding force of Native voices in our work there. So we weren't curating a story that we wanted the rest of the world to know about Native people. We created an arena where Native people would be in charge of the stories they wanted to tell. And then reciprocity is always at the core of this work. Mm-hmm. You tell a story, and then I tell you what I hear, and then you ask me a question, and then I tell you my story. And hopefully my story causes you to understand things both about yourself and perhaps about your story.
Yeah.
And then it's through that back and forth oral tradition that how human beings have communicated and known each other since the beginning of language. That's the reciprocity that I think often our culture misses, and to some extent perhaps broadcasting usurps, because there's one narrative, it's told in quick sound bites, and then it's over, and then we move on to the next sound bite and then the next thing. And so Native people have been spoken for hundreds of years, and mostly as the enemy of the United States and Europeans. So it's only through this last few generations of people who've had access to higher education and to what we think of as fine art, where Native people are taking control of the narrative to say what's important to our communities. And there's not a homogenous pan-Indian point of view. We can talk more about that in a little bit.
And I did want to apologize both to you as our hosts and also to our audience and to Randy. I often say we because it was Native Voices Theater Company, and that's the we that I refer to. I don't mean to include myself in the company of Native people as an artist. I'm not a Native artist. And so I just want to make sure that that's clear to your audience.
Thank you. Why the Autry? Why put it at the Autry Museum? I mean, was that a natural progression because that's where you found a home, and then you thought, oh, well, let's become the resident company because we already have a home?
There's a piece of that happened later, but ultimately it was through contacts with Jeannie's people that Jeannie had worked with in her acting career who said we should go over to the Autry. And so we had visits to the Autry. We made ourselves known as people that were doing the work we were doing in Illinois. And then the head of programs asked us to view the Autry and go through it and give them sort of like, well, what do people that think about Native things all the time think about? And, the first time through the Autry, it was really difficult. And we mostly just said, you probably don't want to know a lot of what we're thinking about. But we admire that the work that you're doing and what you're doing, but we don't see Native people represented here or included in this narrative. And so we don't want to denigrate the work that's here. And that turned out to be the right thing to say, because they said, that's actually what we need. We don't have Native people in this space. We can't figure out why we don't. And then we just started sort of deconstructing, things like one of the major galleries was the conquest of the West. So if those old ideas are pervasive, why do BIPOC people see themselves in some arenas and self-select out of others? And so it was through that discourse that we just started to work. We worked on a particular exhibition called Powerful Images of American Indians Through History. And we talked about, look, you're historicizing Indians by the way you're telling this story. You need to have live Indians. And they kept saying, we can't have Indians in the galleries. It's like, you have a theater. Let's put a play up with Native people telling stories that's important to them. Yeah. And they had never thought of themselves as having a theater. They had a movie theater. And of course, we're theater makers. It's like, hey, we usually do it on the lawn or, next to the cafeteria or whatever, right? We're doing theater where young people do theater. And as we started that conversation, they were shocked at the people who would come to the building. who had never been there before. It also opened up a series of conversations that were not always the simplest to have. And so we would be there for a year, and then we'd be there for a 3-year grant cycle, and then this grant led to that grant. And all of a sudden, they started thinking about who the Autry was in the late 80s when it was founded, in the early 90s when it was not perceived as a significant cultural institution in the city of Los Angeles, and a vision for what Los Angeles might want from a cultural institution that talked about the history of the American West. And that became Native Voices. And our CEO just retired, Rick West, and he's somebody worth Googling. He founded the National Museum of the American Indian for the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., which is on the mall next to the Capitol. So he's a huge influence in American art and Native American art. And he gave his interviews about what it meant the most to him, and he cited Native Voices as one of the two things, because he said they're non-flinching in how they present Native issues and cause conversations about the issues of our time. And we don't present one point of view. We present a curated body of work that starts to provoke conversations, and conversations are always part of the work. My favorite part about going to see a play usually is tipping one back in the bar afterward, talking about, well, what'd you see? Well, what'd you see? That's the most exciting part, because then I start watching the play in a more engaged way, because I know I'm going to talk with somebody who's really cool afterward, and we're going to talk about what we saw and heard and thought about.
The fundamental of theatre is that it is the ultimate shared experience in art.
Yes, yeah. And the Autry, I have to say, at that particular time, Randy and I were both in academia, and the Autry, I think, was very forward-thinking and wanted to be inclusive. It was seen as a quote-unquote cowboy museum. And John Gray was the CEO at that time. No, actually, Joanne Hale was CEO, and then John Gray. And we got tremendous support. And still we have a new CEO who just came in, Steve Aaron, who is also, he comes from UCLA. He was head of the history department.
And also Mrs. Autry wanted this too. I mean, she really did want more than her husband's memory. She really wanted to provide a pathway for what had come from that and what could happen because of it. And of course, if any of us want to make something happen 100 years or 50 years after the prime of our career, we have to put something in place that's going to have that happen. We can't do it. We can't speak to it. And that's some long-term thinking and very artistic thinking. And, we owe a big debt to those folks.
Yeah, and I like to bring that up simply because I think it's important to consider who your partners are and what their motives are, and how you're creating certain kinds of collaborations and partnerships.
In the play development process, did you pick a certain amount of time? How did you decide whose story to tell? Is there, sorry, this is like a long, complicated question, because I was talking to one of your directors, Katie, Randy, that you had suggested that, and we were talking about how is it decided what is allowed to be included in a story. And she said most of playwrights that have produced more, are published more, know where the line is drawn, where a lot of new playwrights don't necessarily know. Does that make sense?
I would say that line is always in motion.
Mm-hmm.
Any kind of community that's been spoken about and for so long, there are a lot of voices that believe they're really powerful in saying what the line is, what could be included. So one of the things we did early on was we always tried to match playwrights with cultural advisors, because each culture that's represented on stage theoretically should have some voice in how they want to be perceived. And for instance, we did a play, Kino and Teresa, which is an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet set in the Pueblo Revolt.
I did
Juliet's Spanish, he's Pueblo.
Yeah.
And there was a time we had a Jemez war chief who was our Jemez, and was set in the Jemez Pueblo as our advisor. There was language, there was dance, lots of things were in the play. There was an election right before the play opened. He gets a call from the new governors and officials, and they said, we don't want any of that stuff in the play. We haven't had time to think about it, and we don't feel it's appropriate, and we're not sure if maybe some private things are being shared.
Language, also language.
So it was language and dance and music. And so, the day before we're opening, we're busy, making those substitutions to honor the self-determination of that community and that people. And then, it didn't go down easy with the actors, particularly, actors are always just high as kites right before the day you open. And then Romeo and Juliet, there's a little bit of testosterone on stage. And so, there was this energy around it. Well, that was amazing for the play. And we had to just keep talking and walking with people, lots of coffee, lots of walks to the parking lot to try to help people see what was going on. I think everybody that was involved with that production a month later was so proud of that communal decision to support the voice and the decisions of the community represented on stage. And as those things become more fixed, when each community is not trying to survive to the next day and get past the trauma that is historical and inherited in Indian communities, things might be a little bit more fixed. But, it'd be like if we were to go to a group of Christians and say, which Lord's Prayer do we put on stage? There's still a fight about those kinds of things. And, we're talking about a set of ideas that have been in power and play for a long time. So we really have to navigate those deep beliefs with deep respect. And we don't decide what goes on stage. We try to get a community of people together to support the playwright as the playwright's deciding what they want to do. And I think the more experienced playwrights know what it's like to make serious mistakes and alienate a community, and then feel the strength of that community advocating for self-representation. I think young people have a tendency to, the way you get noticed is thumb your nose at your parents, right? That's how you start to get and make your own voice. So we're trying to make space for both. And ultimately, we don't put people out there to live and die on their own. We surround them with information and advisors and people that they hopefully can trust and listen to. It's like every other artistic process, right?
Right.
If you've got a director that's going to come in there and say, you do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, you got one mind in the room telling everybody what to do. You've got a director that comes in there and says, well, I think we're going to do these things and my vision is this. And we start to get really great visual images from the design team and great language from the writers or the playwright. The actors are bringing their own ego into it. Now, it has to be a really smart director that can ride that wild animal that becomes this company of artists making something that the audience can't deny. They just have to watch because it's so exciting.
Right.
So we use the theater process for very native means and native informed, indigenized, someone would say.
And turning to you now, good sir. See how I worded that? I worked that right in there, right? So your influences as a playwright. Who influenced you?
I wrote
most?
a play this summer and they were saying, who are your influences as a playwright? Well, I had 50 native playwrights in the list. And then I was early in my career, I was very influenced by sort of the poetic realists, the people that you would study in theater class. And then as I got to grad school and started seeing contemporary theater, again, I was reared in the Midwest. So I had never been to New York until I was in grad school in New York. So my experiences and exposures were very limited. And to some extent, I just love being exposed to great work. kind of like Tom Stoppard's saying that, you know, Hamlet's not necessarily a great play, but you see it on the right night, it's incredible. But, you know, we've all seen terrible productions too. So it is the show, the artists on stage when you're there. I love going to openings. I love going to closings. They're always exciting. And, you know, my playwrights, you know, everything from Spider-Woman and Hane Gigama and Bill Yellowrobe, the early playwrights that were known in professional, and Bruce King in professional groups. Then I met a bunch of Canadians who had been producing theater for about 20 years before the United States provided any resources for American Indians, Native American, U.S. Native American Indians to have any kind of resources. Native Voices was really early in that process. Now there are several theater companies producing, and I mean Native-centric, Native-led. And then there are lots of opportunities for collaborations with theater companies that have resources. And that was the reason Off the Rails was so impactful. It was the first well-resourced production by a Native playwright at the theater company, Oregon Shakespeare Festival, in their 82-year history. And they actually resourced the production in a way that could make it competitive with the other work. And they had set up to lose all this money on it because it's a Native play. It actually was the highest grossing per seat available for the 4-month run it had. It had a completely sold out run. They were able to do dynamic pricing. I mean, and they were able to get community members in there either for underwritten tickets or at a really significant discount. So, I mean, you know, they were very progressive in how they were looking at it. But Native work actually can also function on an economic level that makes it reasonable. And so we're starting to see Hollywood get involved by presenting work from Native people or with Native content.
Right. And so speaking of Off the Rails, let's segue into Off the Rails. That's what I was heading towards. Why Measure for Measure? So, sorry, you please give a synopsis of Off the Rails, if you would be so kind.
Actually, this would be a great place to play that clip if Catherine is able to do that. I'll just chatter a little bit till I see it pop. Thanks, Catherine. So what was the question, or what do you want to follow up now that you've seen that?
What was the question? The question was, why Measure for Measure?
Well, Measure for Measure is, for many of us Shakespeare nerds, it's like a secret crush. Many of us will admit to, one of my 3 favorite plays, I don't know why I say this, by Shakespeare, but it's Measure for Measure. And it is this sort of admission, because it's such a problem play in many different ways. And yet there's something really truthful and powerful at the core of it. And so I was speaking with my colleague, Rob Casely, about, I think we could do a pretty light adaptation of Measure for Measure. And, we just set it in the boarding school system. We make the people that the violence is being inflicted upon unjustly Indian people. And I think we have something. And he said, I think that could work. And then as we started working on it, one of the things I've always thought about Measure for Measure is when Angelo sentences the noble young man to death. I always thought, as a kid who came from nothing, it was like, he's a rich kid. He's going to get away with this. They're not going to kill him. But when off the rails, Angelo sentences the young native guy to death, they're going to kill him right away. And there's really not much anybody could do. And when it's framed as rape and all the different things that were going on in history at that time, and the more we would so you say, how long are these plays workshopped? We presented this play about 6 months after I came up with this cutting, and we would read the cutting with the company, and they'd say, you got to work harder. This is too much of Shakespeare. You need to really make it yours. And then Jeannie had this wonderful idea about, we'll make the women the power brokers in this story. Women have agency in Native communities. And, and so it was like, okay, how do we take the Duke storyline and give it to Overdone? And we really set the play in European society and the brothel, and Native people are sort of tiptoeing around both. And we said we couldn't go to the boarding school because it was almost like trying to stage work about the Holocaust. As soon as we go inside the camps, the atrocity takes over everything. And of course, the atrocities in the boarding school system were focused on children. And as soon as we start seeing children humiliated, and I think you're probably seeing this in contemporary news reports now, where they're finding these unmarked mass graves at most of the major boarding school sites. Mm-hmm. It's so hard. And so it was like, well, off the rail, Measure for Measure is so dark and disturbing, but there's something about the comic structure that lets the audience stay engaged, because you say, I know how comedies work. I think this is a comedy. I think it's going to end okay. And so we pulled back from the brutality, scene after scene after scene, and just sometimes let the play get into the horrors of government intervention to try to destroy cultures and people. And of course, I had said back when it was produced, it reminded me of Afghanistan. And it's so breathtakingly sad of how much it does relate to that contemporary story now.
Mm-hmm.
I must say, if I can jump in, that one of the things that, apart from what fascinates me about Measure for Measure, is its universality. The fundamental theme is universal. Man, proud man, dressed with little brief authority. Is that, you mentioned that the parallels with the number of bodies being found in Canada at the moment of Native American children parallels exactly to the number of bodies being found in Ireland that were the responsibility of the Catholic Church. There is a constant universality throughout all of these stories. I'll maybe reference that a bit later on, but it is the fact that all our stories are the same. It is the circumstances and the geographic conditions that change, but the fundamental about human behavior never seems to change. On one other point, your slip-sliding between vernacular and Shakespeare in that script is astonishingly good. When I first read it, I kept going, no, wait a minute, that's Shakespeare. You did a superb job. So congratulations on that.
That's
one of my funnest things. Yeah.
That's I was gonna say that too. I'm like, all of a sudden I'd be like, oh, that's verse. Then I'd have to back up and go, how did he just do that to me? And I miss it.
Very, very
Sorry,
clever.
Jean, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Randy was just relentless, going through the script and finding the ways to um, enfranchise all of these characters in such a new and exciting way. And once he made Mistress Overdone sort of the driver of the action of the play, and his specificity for each of the tribal nations that are represented on stage, both in terms of the difference between them, but also generational differences. The difference between Alexei and Momaday, and it was just it was such a wonderful journey. We had Sharon. I'm not sure if you were already. I think you were already gone, but we had put together a what is it called, Randy? A group of actors that we were working with on a regular basis. So we would meet weekly. And one of the first things that everybody said they wanted to look into, and this was back in 2009 or 10, were the boarding schools. And we had a number of actors whose parents and or who had been to the boarding schools. And so we started this whole research system, and all read the same books and borrowed the books and passed the books around. And it was at the same time that Randy was thinking about the Measure for Measure and setting it in the boarding school. And it just, I think it came together so beautifully. And as Alan said, it has just such a universality about it. We were astounded at the audiences at Oregon Shakespeare Festival. Over 22,000 people saw that play. And the majority of them, many of them, didn't know anything about the American Indian boarding school system. And so all of the study guides and the programs and the feature articles and all of those things that also surrounded the play, and then the play itself, to think that 22,000 people went home and said, "Did you know this happened?" I think was quite moving. And at the end of the play, when they dance, finally, they gave themselves their own permission to dance. They didn't wait for anybody to tell them they could. The audience leapt to their feet to acknowledge what was happening on stage. It was astounding.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Something to just piggyback, you talk about how language comes together. There was so much of I'm dyslexic, so there's so much about the writing of the play that was about listening to performers in the room. And then once the actors started seeing me do that, well, they'd come up and they'd say, "Hey, if this were this and this is that, this is almost iambic, or you're like 6 syllables off here. Do you want to go this way or that way with it? Do you want to go further toward the verse or put it more in prose?" And it became this group think. At the same time, everybody let me be in charge of it.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that's Bill Rausch, who was the director and the artistic director of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. He was always clear that this is going to be the play Randy writes. So that it wasn't like all the actors, I'm going to say it however I want to say it. So they got more and more precise. And then we would have really tough conversations. There was a time where Mariana left with Angelo, like she does in the original script. Mm-hmm. And the actress said, "You can't, why are we doing it this way?" I said, "I've always had questions about this." And we had, very tearful conversations about people we know and people that are in these kinds of relationships and have faced this kind of abuse and why people stay with their abusers. And ultimately, the script changed to what was produced and what you read. And again, that came out of very tough, heartfelt conversations. And there was space for that in the process. Mm-hmm. And now I feel like as we're going into subsequent productions, I have a little bit of just cleaning up a few places I want to do. I think it's just a little long, just a little. So all that just...
One of the curses of being a writer in any way, shape, or form is it's never finished. It's never finished.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about the whole topic of the boarding schools and their influence and effects? Sharon, do you have a question on that point?
No, go ahead.
Well, let's bring to it. Let's because several of the plays that I've read, this whole topic of this determination by what we might call European America to turn Native America into more European America really was in post the Great Migration. It seems to me the most damaging thing that was done to the nations.
It was another form of genocide.
Yeah.
Well, there was a raging
Attempted
debate.
genocide.
You're probably familiar with Frank L. Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz, who ran a newspaper in South Dakota right after the Indian Wars. And he wrote very eloquently and persuasively about why we need to exterminate the rest of the Native Americans. They were down to 200,000. And, you know, we know that this is someone of great literary skill. And there was a huge debate about whether to finish the job of killing off the rest of the indigenous people of this land. Or was there anything else that could happen? And Richard Pratt, had developed a prisoner of war camp where, and this is a good place to bring up that one image, one of those ledger art images that you sent me, Catherine. It was on the yellow paper. I think they're numbered 3A, B, and C, and you could put them in progression. But basically, in this prisoner of war camp, they had all these native people from a series of wars in Oklahoma that they normally would execute. And instead, they sent them to Pratt, who said he could reform them. And so he put them in military dress, cut their hair, forced them to speak English. They couldn't speak to each other because they were from different tribes, so that they didn't actually share a language. And this ledger art that we're looking at now became a key communication tool for intertribal people and these prisoners in this camp. The people that were imprisoned from war didn't want war. They were just protecting their home. And when Pratt said, I rehabilitated them 3 years later and was able to release them back into the wilds, and they marvelously didn't kill anyone, well, then he had the system that all he had to do was cut everybody's hair, force them to speak English, treat them as military, put them in constant drills, and wear them out. And so that was his school system. He did it with former slaves, and then it became the American Indian boarding school system. And Carlisle, very close to you, was the first one. And the system expanded like crazy. And so they felt like one of the things that was really crucial is they had to have these schools at least 200 to 300 miles away from the indigenous lands of the people, the children that were being educated there. And what they were being taught were the skills of servants. Thank you so much. So this is the propaganda photo of the era. So this is how they arrived. This is what civilization turned them into. And of course, you can see that this is staged. This is wildly staged when you think about how the technology of cameras and so forth, and the composition, the backdrop that's painted, the rug. So this idea of educating the savage really made the liberals of the day feel very good, because in their mind, they were at least not exterminating everybody. It's as if everybody in Germany had gotten together and said, what if we don't murder all the Jews? I think so in that era, you would think that'd be great. But looking back on it, and of course, as you mentioned, Alan, anytime we warehouse children, mostly refugees and the products of warfare whose families have been destroyed, and then you warehouse them generation after generation. And what was the goal was to teach them to be servants for the wealthy folks. Yeah. And that was it.
The philosophy was kill the Indian, save the man. Meaning that to kill everything that was in an individual about their language, their life, their culture, their family systems. Kill all of that.
It reminded me, in terms of children, of the famous Jesuit quote, "Give me a child at the age of 7 and he'll be ours for life."
Yeah.
That it wasn't so much educating the Indian as changing it into a completely different person. So when you use your analogy of the Holocaust, it wasn't about let's not kill the Jews, it was let's turn them into Gentiles, is the notion. And it's appalling. I mean, you actually quoted the well-known phrase earlier of how the West was won. The reality is how the West was lost.
Exactly.
It was lost by an attempt to basically destroy whole nations.
Yes.
Wipe them out. It was a Holocaust.
And
enormous
Alan, so there is evidence that Hitler read and studied the American Indian boarding school system when they were creating
to devise
their
the concentration camps,
to deal with the problem that they had. So he was looking at that to model what they were going to do, and then of course he went.
To come back to the theatre side of it, there is one play I read, and because I'm old and crumbling, the title has gone straight out of my head. Sharon will remind me. Based on the true story in Oklahoma of the boys who tried to get
Indolent
back.
Boys.
Indolent Boys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indolent Boys.
Yeah.
That play, I just found it so sad, so depressing. I'll definitely want to put it on. It's so sad and so depressing. But it is not because only of its specificity as to what happened to the children of that tribe, and as you say, moved a couple of 100 miles away from where their family lived, who tried to escape, an Oklahoma winter with snow and ice and freezing cold, and died. But it's what appealed to me so much about that, because I tend to think of theater in classic terms, of classic themes, is universal. That story could be set anywhere about any specific group of children, be they in Ireland, it can be, how the travelers were treated, or, how the dirt farmers were treated, how illegitimate children were treated. But it could be it is that same story that affects all of us. And that's why it's important, I think, that it is told in its own terms, in its own language, language in the sense of its own writing, of its own storytelling. It becomes universal because it is so specific.
When Scott Momaday wrote The Indolent Boys, that's why our character who might be killed unjustly is named Momaday. The term indolent boys is used when they're deciding which children they're going to kill and which not.
Yeah.
So the stories should reference each other and should contain a reverence for those who persevered. And again, we wanted to tell a story, Jeannie and I personally, this particular story about people that survived, because we feel that, someone had to survive for me to be here.
Yeah.
We spent a year with the ensemble reading all of the different materials, including and Scott Momaday's beautiful play. And about 9 months in, we were also devastated and limp and depressed. And how do we look at this? And we did start to pull out and discover those stories of resilience. And that was the thing that the actors in the ensemble said they wanted to concentrate on, because as Randy said, without that resilience, without that secret speaking their own language in a hallway or in a basement or wherever they could do it, and passing down what they knew, a 10-year-old to a 5-year-old, what they knew of their people, without that, Randy and the entire ensemble wouldn't be here. So we also did a traveling show called Stories from the Indian Boarding Schools, and it's 5 or 6 stories that the ensemble wrote that pulled out of the research that we did. And there's both sad and resilient stories. But the thrust of it was resilience.
But you're right. The Indolent Boys is an incredibly moving piece, and it's beautiful in production. We've seen it. I realize we're getting close to time. I didn't know if we've been talking a lot. Did you get a chance to ask the questions you wanted, Sharon? Is there something else we should have gotten to?
It flowed. I'm good. I was going to ask if there was anybody out there listening, watching, if they had any specific questions.
Yeah,
not for me, for Randy or Jean.
Have any questions? Put them in the comment section, or as I always say to you, you can send us an email. We'll get back to you with a response if you have any questions. Usually the questions start coming in. Oh, there you go. That was just thank you, Marlene. Thank you. And that's a very important point, Marlene, that I know from my own experience in Ireland. There is so much about Irish history that Irish people do not know, do not see, do not learn, do not understand. And so much about, when you talk about Indigenous Americans, you are talking about American history, which did not start with the conquistadores. It did not start with the Pilgrim Fathers. It started thousands of years before that. And, we don't teach people enough. We don't expose these stories enough. One of the great Irish folk playwrights, John B Keane, everybody knows John Millington Synge, but John B Keane, who we've done a couple of his plays, who wrote plays about poverty, and they were comedies, and they were tragic, and they were true. And that's why I think that the work you've done and continue to do is so important, because we need to understand that fundamental of theater, that tragedy and comedy go hand in hand. We have to expose truths, and the best way sometimes to expose a truth is to entertain while doing it, which is why I think your magnificent reworking of Measure for Measure is a perfect exponent of what I'm talking about. And as I say, I am sincerely hoping that we'll be able to stage it in the next couple of years. But as you say, we're out of time. I do want to invite you both back at some point. There's Grace in Dublin. We Irish were so honoured to offer support to the Choctaw people during the pandemic, which was also done, that the Irish made collections and support for the Choctaw Nation. There is a really serious bond there, and it's a bond of recognition of people who are victims, not by their own, not for reasons that they are responsible for, or they are simply victims because of who they are and what they are, which is one of the bad things in this world. What are some of the authors and titles you would like to see featured on such courses for beginners with regard to American literature? If the pair of you can send me some, and I know Sharon has some expertise in this area, but if you think there are titles of books or plays that should be read at college level, let us know. We'll put it up on the website.
That was a question right there.
There you go. Thank you, Dennis, for preempting Sharon's question. Well done. So as I say, I hope that we can bring you back, and certainly I hope we're going to see you in Pittsburgh in the next couple of years, because we are going to put that show on one way or another, because I love it. It's wonderful, and it's a wonderful way to make use of my favorite playwright. So thank you again to Jean, thank you to Randy, and thank you again to Sharon. See you soon. And I hope to see you both again soon. Bless you. So to everybody else, thank you for being with us. I hope that interested you. I hope if you knew nothing on the topic, that it at least tickled your taste buds. As I say, over the next few years, we will be introducing Native American playwrights, both in terms of our stage reading program and in terms of full production. It is a vastly important area of American theater culture that I don't think that we see remotely enough of. And it is, by anybody's definition, the term classic theater. So more about that in the future. But in the meantime, thank you for being there. Thank you to the Allegheny Foundation as usual. Thank you to all of you who do send donations. And to those of you who haven't yet, I know it's merely a slip of the memory, but that you will send a few dollars. You can go to our website there it is, pigtheatre.org with 2 T's. You can make a donation there. And you can also catch up on this webinar and all other webinars on our YouTube channel, which you'll also find a link on the website. And do ask your friends as well to join us on those YouTube broadcast, on the YouTube channel. In the meantime, I will see you next week, and thank you all for being there. Bye.